The reading is taken from Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 and 18. When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is in unseen. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks so much, David. Just to say again, it's so great to be here this morning. When we meet and gather and pray and worship in Lord's Hill, we often think about what's happening here at St. Mary's. And you may not know, but every Tuesday our whole staff team still comes over to Lodge Road and we pray and worship together. And so it feels just like an extended family being back here. And we'll be praying for the guys in Lord's Hill meeting at the same time as well. I wanted to tell you about one of the most kind of incredible things I've ever witnessed, which is when we were on holiday in Morocco, which you'll probably know is a predominantly Muslim country. And we happened to be there during Ramadan. Looking a bit, don't we just blend in with the locals there? Fresh-faced. But during that month of Ramadan, what happens is everybody fasts together during the day. And then as the evening approaches, as the sun is about to go down, everyone jumps into action. And there's this kind of contagious hubbub of activity, of kind of eating and laughing and celebration in anticipation of the sun going down and the fast being broken. That continues for the whole month of Ramadan, where Muslims focus on fasting, prayer, and giving, before then finishing with a 3-day period of fasting to end the month. Now, you may have known some of those details already, but what you may not know is that actually the principle behind Ramadan, which began in the 7th century, was actually heavily influenced by the existing Christian tradition of fasting until sundown throughout the whole of Lent, the 40 days before Easter. And as John said, fasting was a regular practice throughout the Old Testament. Then into the New Testament, Jesus says, when you fast. The early church fasted regularly, and really right up until recent church history, Christians across the world have virtually all fasted every Wednesday and every Friday, with an extended period of fasting either during Lent or at the start of the new year. Just to give you a flavour of that, John Wesley, who many of you will have heard of, the Anglican priest, who then founded the Methodist Church, he would only consider people for full-time ministry if they fasted twice a week. And he actually observed how that pattern had started to slip. He said this in the 18th century. He said, they don't even fast twice in a month, let alone twice in a week. Amen to that. One amen. What this shows us, though, is that biblical history and then church history and the early church and moving on through the ages, there's always been this strong, unbreakable link between food and our relationship with God. A rhythm, if you like, of dependence and delight, both in feasting. Jesus spent so much of his time, didn't he, around the table, but also in fasting as we starve the body to feed the soul. And yet, really, we find ourselves, don't we, today, in a world where the practice of fasting is virtually non-existent in Western Christianity. But I believe that God's design for us was to eat moderately, regularly fast, but then regularly feast. And it seems that maybe we've forgotten how to do both. And I would start today by suggesting that we've forgotten how to feast because we've forgotten how to fast. And so that's what I want to explore this morning as we land this series on the Lord's Prayer, Teach Us to Pray. I want us to explore prayer's best friend, if you like, the practice of fasting. And we want to do that to unlock another dimension of our walk with Jesus. I believe there is a gift waiting for you, for each of you this morning, on the other side of fasting. The verse says, doesn't it, when you fast, your Father in heaven will reward you. Now, I'm sure already there are probably lots of kind of thoughts and feelings maybe coming up to the surface because it's a difficult issue to navigate. You might be thinking, well, what am I fasting from? Or how often? Or do I have to do this? What about medical conditions or issues of body image? Do I need to cancel my lunch plans today? Maybe you've got a Valentine's lunch lined up. Are you going to have to go without food? And these are all great, valid questions that I'm going to attempt to navigate quite sensitively this morning. But maybe even now, in this moment, why not allow some of those questions and some of those potential fears to kind of come to the surface of your emotions? And even now, you can invite God into the process, can't you? You can be open and saying, well, God, what would you have for me today around this subject of fasting? What areas of breakthrough maybe and answered prayer, God, do you have waiting for us on the other side of fasting? Which stories of lives transformed do you have waiting for us on the other side of prayer and fasting, working together? Because isn't that what we want to see as a church here and at Lord's Hill and across the city? Greater breakthrough, greater freedom, more people saved into the kingdom. Are we excited about that this morning? I moved to Southampton quite a long time ago now when I came here for university. And it was the same kind of time in history when kind of Facebook just came out and there was kind of Facebook events for everything, an event for everything, a walk before church, lunch event, events for everything. And me and my friends decided to create an event called the Henry VIII Banquet. And the idea was we'd get loads of guys together and basically eat as much meat as we could for as long as we could, just to kind of see what happens. And so I started off feeling quite heroic. I had a chicken leg in each hand and kind of feeling very proud of the event that we'd made. But kind of 2 kilos of meat later, with the kind of garlic and herb kind of oozing from my pores, everybody else then seemed to be able to carry on and head out to the university nightclub. And I ended up kind of slumped in a corner, more Henry the Hoover than Henry VIII at that point. A strange thing to do kind of looking back. And maybe in my mind, that's what it means to kind of feast and to indulge and overindulge, kind of withholding from food for a bit and then just going crazy. But I don't think that's what we're talking about when we're thinking about a rhythm of fasting and feasting. I think it's much more about creating a rhythm of life where we learn to regularly fast and regularly feast like Jesus did. Because Jesus is our model and example for everything. And we see very clearly that Jesus feasted and Jesus fasted. He spent so much of his ministry, didn't he, gathered around a table. He invited those on the margins to eat with him. He connected with his disciples over food. He cooked them breakfast on the beach after his resurrection. Jesus left us, didn't he, bread and wine for us to remember him by around the table. And it was in the breaking of bread that those on the road to Emmaus had their eyes opened and recognized him. And even as we look ahead to the future kingdom, the image that we're given, one of the images, is one of a great banquet. Jesus is very much in favor of food, isn't he? Food isn't a bad thing. He is the king of the feast. And yet Jesus also fasted. He began his ministry not with a big worship service or a book launch, but with 40 days in the desert fasting. And when tempted by Satan, he replied saying, well, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And Jesus then passed this on to his disciples. He said to them, when you fast. Another time he even said to them, to unlock this situation requires prayer and fasting. And what Jesus was doing, he wasn't coming up with a new idea. He was building on the idea of fasting found in the Old Testament. The first mention of fasting that we find is in the book of Exodus when Moses fasted for 40 days. There was then a command given to the Israelites to fast on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the year. And we see that practice of fasting continued by David and Samuel and Esther and the prophets. We then come into the New Testament where Jewish people would fast twice a week until sundown. The early Christian teachings also commanded fasting every Wednesday, every Friday. In addition, they would fast for 2 full days before baptism, all the way through Lent until sundown, and then from Friday through to Sunday at Easter. In fact, this is fascinating. By the 4th century, fasting was so common in the church actually had to ban fasting on the Sabbath to ensure that people were feasting enough. Think about how far we've come from then. Imagine us being a people so desperate for God that we had to start banning fasting and prayer and Bible reading to make sure that people were having a break. I don't think we're there quite yet, are we? And that practice of fasting twice a week continued through most of Christian history until just a couple of 100 years ago, when really the effects of the Enlightenment caused us to focus on the mind over the body. And what happens as theology becomes increasingly disembodied is that it's very tempting to prioritize comfort over any kind of suffering or discomfort. And so that leaves us in a place today where most Christians feast, but very few fast. A recent survey showed that less than 2% of Christians fast weekly, and around half have never fasted. In today's culture, you're more likely probably to hear about fasting from a fitness guru or a dietitian or from a Muslim than you are from a Christian. Now, as I just said, just the idea, the word fasting can maybe bring up or trigger some issues around body shaming or ongoing eating disorders, which of course we need to be so sensitive to, and some of those require medical intervention. And that's not what we're talking about here when we're talking about fasting. We're talking about another opportunity for intimacy with God, one that's been practiced throughout the ages as a key way of connecting our mind and body and spirit. One of the central practices of Jesus, but perhaps the single most neglected in the Western church. And so after that kind of long introduction, I wanted to move on to what is fasting, just so we know that we're on the same page, what we're talking about. Well, quite simply, fasting is not eating food. See you next week. Fasting is not eating food, but that's important because sometimes people will say, I'm fasting from TV, or I'm fasting social media. Now, they might be great things to do, and that's between you and God. They might be something that you want to stop doing. But really, that is abstinence. That's not fasting. The word fasting means not eating food. And you also may hear people say, well, I'm on a caffeine fast, or I'm on the Daniel fast, just eating vegetables. And again, they could be good things for you to do, and you might be prompted to do them. But that isn't what fasting is. That's abstinence or a restricted diet. Interestingly, even in the whole book of Daniel, the word fasting isn't used once. He's abstaining, or they're abstaining from different foods. And so really the biblical pattern is to eat, to feast, and to fast. To eat moderate amounts each day, to fast regularly, and to feast on the Sabbath. And we see in the Bible the way that is expressed really is in two ways. Fasting in the Bible is rhythm and its response. So rhythm in the Old Testament, where you're commanded to fast on certain days of the year, and then into the New Testament with Jewish people and then early Christians fasting 2 days a week. That is fasting regularly as a rhythm of fasting to your life. But then actually the most common biblical concept of fasting was as a response. Whether that was a national crisis, or it could have been an invasion, or in response to some kind of sin or grief or loss, or as one writer puts it beautifully, in response to life's sacred moments. Periods of fasting were called for as a response. We see that in 1 Samuel 31, King Saul dies, and the entire nation fasts for 7 days. Or Jonah chapter 3, Nineveh is warned of its destruction, and so the king calls for this city-wide fast, and the city is spared. Or Esther chapter 4, the Hebrew people were threatened as the Queen Esther calls for a 3-day fast, and they are saved. So that's fasting as a response to a situation. And it's so tempting, if you're anything like me, when we're under stress, one of the things we can turn to is almost attempting to snack our way to happiness. But actually, what God calls us to do is to respond to life's sacred moments by fasting, by depending on God and sharpening our prayers. So that is what fasting is, and I want to spend the rest of our time briefly looking at 4 elements of why we would do this thing called fasting. Last year was a big year in our household because Tottenham ended their 17-year wait for a trophy. Okay? And what happened in our house as that moment, as the final whistle blew, there was a standing ovation. Some of us were jumping, Jesse's smiling. Some of us were in tears, and we're using our bodies to express our gratitude for Ange Postecoglou. And you may have been in a similar situation, though, at a sporting event where you find yourself jumping for joy. Or you might have watched a film or a play recently that's brought you to tears. You know, when we experience shame, we often walk with our heads looking down. And when we're filled with confidence, we tend to stand a little taller. And all that is to say that fasting diminished in the church following the Enlightenment when we attempted to separate our body from our mind. But Christianity is fundamentally an embodied religion, meaning you don't just have a body, but you are a body. And so it's not just that our kind of soul teaches our body what to do, but actually there's a way in which our body teaches our soul. And meaning what we do with our body has a significant impact on our walk with Jesus. And we know that to be true of exercise, of food, of sleep, of our sexuality. It all matters deeply what we do with our body. You know, prior to Jesus' death and resurrection, the Jewish people fasted on Mondays and Thursdays. But the first Christians changed this to Wednesdays and Fridays. Why is that? Well, Wednesdays was the day that Jesus was betrayed in the garden, and Friday was the day he was crucified. And so fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays was seen as a way of offering ourselves to Jesus, offering our whole selves, not just our minds, but our bodies in worship and identifying with him. You know, we've all been there, finishing a whole pack of biscuits when we only need one. It might seem like a small thing in the moment, but actually the loss of human agency is never minor. You know, we can so easily enter those cycles, can't we, of using food as a comfort and then feeling bad about it. And so then what do we do to ease the shame? Well, we comfort eat some more. And really we could map that cycle, if you like, as a cycle of indulgence and shame. Whereas God calls us up, he has better plans for our lives than that. He wants us to enter the worship cycle of dependence and delight. Because you see, no meal will ever truly fill us, because only God is the bread of life. Food will never be enough, and so we just try to keep on eating. But through fasting and trusting, we then learn how to feast and rejoice. So firstly, we fast to offer ourselves to God. And secondly, we fast to grow in holiness. And one of the reasons you'll hear about fasting from fitness influencers and dietitians is that it's been shown in study after study to have many physical health benefits. And you can look into those. Incredible things happen to your body as you fast to do with digestion and your metabolism, and it cleanses harmful and damaged cells. But beyond the physical health benefits, Christian fasting helps us to grow in holiness. It's almost like what health is to the body, holiness is to the soul. And fasting is the soul's way of purifying and purging the whole person. You know, whereas like the pleasure principle asks the question, well, what feels good in the moment? And then says, you know, well, if it feels good, then do it. It's kind of like short-term pleasure, often resulting in long-term damage. Whereas fasting is the total opposite of that. You know, it's not always super fun in the short term, but has incredible benefits over time. You know, it teaches us, doesn't it, how to be happy and content even when we don't get what we want. And it's through fasting that things are revealed revealed what's in our heart. Fasting reveals the things that can control us. You know, I used to think I was quite a patient and considerate person, but genuinely fasting has shown me that I'm actually quite impatient and inconsiderate and just using food to get through the day. Fasting reorders our desires. It draws on the power of God to overcome sin, and it turns our body from an enemy into an ally. And that's why it's so hard to do, especially at first, because you're picking a fight with your flesh. But as you continue and grow in fasting and prayer, I've found that anger and gossip and defensiveness reduce, and contentment and peace and spiritual sharpness, energy levels all increase. In the 20th century, there was a Greek priest who put it rather brutally like this. He said, God sits at the summit of hunger, thirst, and suffering. The devil sits at the summit of a comfortable life. But I kind of want a comfortable life, or at least I think I do. But what I need, what God has for me, is fasting to feed my soul, to grow in holiness, to defeat sin. That was the second reason. The third reason we fast is to amplify our prayers. As I said earlier, fasting and prayer go hand in hand. You know, picture strawberries and cream, or bangers and mash, or pizza and pineapple. Or mixed reaction for that one. Fasting and prayer are paired together throughout the New Testament. You see, the goal of fasting isn't to say, well, great, I've skipped a meal. I've done this fasting thing. The goal of fasting is to use that time and that headspace to connect with God in prayer. And there's a great example of this in Acts chapter 13. We see how prayer and fasting work together, both in terms of hearing from God, but also being heard by him. It says this, while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I've called them. So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. So notice there how they fast and pray to hear from God who they should set aside, but then they continue to fast and pray to then commission Barnabas and Saul to be sent out. It's fasting to hear and fasting to be heard. So we see here that fasting amplifies both our voice to God and God's voice to us. As a church, we're fasting similarly as you guys are here on Wednesdays throughout Lent, and we did that last year as well. And as we do that, we're not doing it to say, well, we fasted now, but we're praying for and contending for the Alpha course, that's happening that same day. For people's actual lives in a spiritual battle, we're shifting the dial through prayer and fasting. As I fast, I often notice a new spiritual sharpness and alertness, or like an attentiveness to the voice of God, and a spiritual hunger that simply can't be achieved any other way. And so I wonder, at the moment in your life, do you have a major decision that you're trying to make? Or are you seeking breakthrough from a habit that just won't seem to shift? Do you have a desire to want to amplify God's voice to you and yours to him? Well, if that is you, then Jesus says, fast and pray. Finally, number 4, we fast to stand with the poor. In the West, we typically throw away around 1/3 of our food, while 40% of the world live in poverty and almost 10% in extreme poverty. And so it's like the world is divided, isn't it, into those with not enough food and those with so much food that we're throwing 1/3 of it away. And really, fasting, one of the things it does is a practice to stand in the gap between those two extremes. Fasting is a way of, by choice, resonating with those who have no choice. And we see that in Isaiah chapter 58. What's happening here is the Israelites are wrestling with God, and they're saying, well, we've been fasting, we've been doing what you've asked us to do, but it seems like you're still not hearing, you're still not responding. And so God answers by saying, well, you may have fasted, but you're not living out and acting out acts of justice. And this is what it says in Isaiah 58. He says, this is the kind of fast I've chosen, to loose the chains of injustice, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke, to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter. And there's been this long, incredible history of Christians standing practically with the poor, because we can't separate our relationship with God from our relationship with our neighbor. And so, yes, fasting will enrich your own spiritual life, but God doesn't just transform us for ourselves, but for the sake of a broken community and city and world. And so many churches, like this one and at Lord's Hill, we run a food bank or a meeting place, marketplace. Some Christians choose to donate the money they would have spent on food when fasting and give it to the poor. There's an incredible tradition in the Catholic Church to fast every Friday and then serve in a soup kitchen on that same day. Because you see, justice isn't about ranting on social media about our beliefs. It's about practically living out the command to serve those on the margins. And really what fasting does is it enables you to become more aware of those people on the margins and those who go regularly without food. There's a guy called Robert Capon. He's an American kind of theologian, priest, and chef. Incredible combination. But he's got this great line, and we'll land with this. He says, "We were given appetites, not to consume the world and forget it, but to taste its goodness and then hunger to make it great." And so as we come into land, God always has something for us every time that we gather together. But that might look slightly different for each of us in the room. And first of all, there's no kind of guilt or shame about whether you have or haven't ever fasted in the past. This is a new opportunity today to start something new or continue and deepen something that you're already doing. And so maybe if God has kind of stirred something up in you, or you might be feeling slightly angry about this challenge, or you might be feeling excited to embrace it, or it might have brought up an issue that you've been struggling with in the past. This is a safe space this morning for us to be able to get alongside you and pray for you. And God is gentle and wise with how he moves us along on this journey. And so ask him even now for insight and wisdom, healing, maybe a reframing of what the word fasting means to you. I know personally, there's been seasons of my life where I've found it helpful to fast on the first of the month. Other seasons, like maybe Lent or Advent, currently it's every Friday. And it does transform your life. But it's not easy to do because you're picking a battle with the flesh. But on the other side of fasting, there is a great reward for each of you here. So don't worry about whether you have or haven't fasted in the past. I've come to learn that no one really is ever ready to do anything, whether that's stepping out into a new job or a new role or something God's called you to do. And it's certainly true of fasting. You'll never be totally ready. All we have is now.